Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 475th meeting since we started in 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give them an hour to make a presentation. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter we listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience who wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said, for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment and close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements? You got one?
I guess, let me see what our next meeting is.
I think our speaker has an announcement. We'll let him make it.
Why don't you make it while you're speaking?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll let you make it when you're speaking. Anybody else have an announcement they want to make? No? Now's the time. Okay, well, next week is America What Went Wrong. John Beasley's our speaker. It's on the itinerary there. I'm not going to read all this. And October 5th, automation is here. The time for universal basic income at Andrew Young is now. That's on your itinerary also. Excel, Colorado, he's talking here on that. October 19th, attaining carbon-free and a dividend. That's Garrett Pennell, he'll be our speaker that day. On October 12th, trying to think who our speaker is. He isn't on here yet, but I got one working right now, so we'll have a speaker for October 12th. Calvin Bluette is the speaker October 12th.
Yeah, you made up this name.
Yeah, no, I did all this, but the brain went dead. You know how it is. Anyway, our speaker tonight is Ken Sauter. He's going to talk about his battle with the IRS. He's in design from Carnegie Mellon, MBA Letourneau University. He raises pertinent questions. Have you ever wondered if income tax is legal, or tried to understand the millions of lines of Byzantine tax code? He advised that perhaps there is a reason for all the confusion. He questions, is the 16th Amendment properly understood as allowing direct taxes on every American? He walks us through his 6-year battle with the IRS and the kinds of shenanigans he's had to deal with in fighting an agency of the government that seem to be invincible and all-powerful, yet can be defeated if you follow the law and just understand what the lawful income tax is all about. Ken argues that most Americans have not historically paid income taxes, and there is good reason for that fact. Mark Twain said, it's not what you don't know that can hurt you, it's what you know for certain that you ain't so. He concludes asking and answering the following question: is what you know about the income tax, are you sure? Can you point to a law that clearly says every American citizen must pay income tax, and can the IRS do that? Well, without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Ken Sauter.
Well, I guess I'll start by making my announcement. Dallas Philosophers Forum is meeting on the 24th of this month at Boca's Italian Restaurant off of Central and Beltline, and Taylor Norwood is speaking on finding truth in an uncertain world. So we welcome you to come to that. More Italian food, by the way. But anyway, before I begin, I want to say that I am not an attorney or a tax professional. If you want tax advice or legal advice, get an attorney or a tax professional. I am sharing my experience and my opinions, and they're fairly strong, but they're my opinions. So, that is what it is. So anyway, this is about my battle with the IRS and the question, does the income tax really apply to all American citizens? And most of us have grown up thinking that we owe income tax, and if you're like me, you paid your income tax for years and years and years, but you didn't really like it. It's like, man, this is a lot of money, and is this really what I need to do? But I didn't know what to do about it. Mark Twain said, it's not what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you know for certain that just ain't so. And have you ever run into somebody that just knows something for certain and you knew it wasn't so? So that's the question. So the question is about the income tax. And Frederick Douglass, who spent quite a bit of his life in slavery, said, find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. How many people quietly submit to paying income taxes? Okay, first of all, I want to make the point that the government doesn't need an income tax. For 130 years, from the founding of this country when the Constitution was written until the 1930s, our government did not have an effective income tax. It did not have an income tax at all until 1862, and it wasn't much of an income tax from then until like the 1940s. And there were more surpluses than deficits during that time. The government survived on custom duties and excise taxes. And the Constitution provides for those things. The government did just fine for 130 years without an income tax. As a matter of fact, you can find political cartoons and articles written in the papers in the 1800s that complained about the surplus monster because the politicians were taking the surplus and blowing it on all kinds of stupid things. If you notice, politicians haven't changed. It doesn't matter if there's a surplus or a deficit, they still spend a lot of money. So those who filed income taxes from 1913 to 2002, the income tax was implemented in 1913, the same time as the Federal Reserve was. And you might ask yourself, is there a relationship there? So this is the percent of those who reported income. So in 1913, basically nobody was paying income tax. And then they got around that there was an income tax, so some people started paying. And in 1924, Calvin Coolidge, a Republican president, signed a 1924 revenue bill which had to do with taxes. And immediately after that, you'll notice that about half the people that were paying taxes stopped paying taxes. It's as if they read the law and said, oh, that doesn't apply to me, so I don't have to do that. And that went on for about 20 years. And after those 20 years, during those 20 years, the people that started the Federal Reserve and instituted the income tax and the 16th Amendment, it was like a whole bunch of stuff that happened all at once. I think G. Edward Griffin wrote a book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which gives you a lot of detail on the machinations of things that went on during that time. But anyway, so there was a propaganda campaign that started in the late 30s. There was a 1939 Tax Act, and that propaganda campaign started paying off, and more people started paying taxes. Now, this is percent of those who reported income. You have to remember that most of America at that time, in the 20s and 30s, was rural. So people lived on farms, and you know, you're not filing government forms. You're selling cows to the local, butcher shop or packing house, and selling your crops to the grocers or whoever it is that's processes all that stuff. You're not reporting to the government. So this is percent of those who reported income, and it jumped up in the 1940s. And the Treasury Department at this time decided that we need to convince more people to pay income taxes. So they hired Disney to use Donald Duck to sell people on the income tax, and they created a movie called The Spirit of 43, which is basically Donald Duck telling you you need to pay income taxes. So that was a propaganda campaign, and you can look this up. I mean, as a matter of fact, there's a sign-up sheet I've got right here, and you can pass that around. And what I want to do is that if you want to sign up, just give your name and email. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out about once a month. I'm going to tell you what's going on with me and the strategies that I'm using and what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so if I find a strategy that works, and I think I found some that do work in fighting the IRS, I'm going to share that, and I'm going to give you all the details of the legal arguments I used and all that, so you can make your decision whether or not you want to join the fight. Okay, now nearly half of all Americans don't pay income taxes. I had a couple different things here to show, but this is really all you need. About 49.5% of Americans who report income actually pay income tax. There's a lot of people that for whatever reason aren't paying income taxes. Some people haven't been reporting at all, haven't been filing, and they're not paying income tax. And so far the IRS leaves them alone. And then there's other people that, you know, they just never got in the system or whatever, and they're just not paying taxes. But there's a lot of different reasons. Some people seem to be able to live their life without being bothered by the IRS. You know, God bless them. You know, I'm not one of those people. But anyway, there's a lot of people that don't pay income taxes. So if you're paying income taxes, you're in the minority. Okay, now this was Ronald Reagan hired the Grace Commission, Peter Grace, and they did a study of government waste, fraud, and abuse. And what they said, which I don't think it's any different now, 100% of what is collected in income tax is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services taxpayers expect from government. So if you think you're paying income taxes to fund infrastructure and such things, that's not what's happening. It's going to pay the Federal Reserve. So the conclusion of what I just showed you is that the United States government does not need an income tax to pay its bills. It had more surpluses before the income tax was implemented than after it was implemented. Taking in more money just encouraged politicians to expand the government and control a greater part of the U.S. economy. Whenever politicians talk about, you know, spending government money like universal health care or, you know, universal basic income or whatever, they're talking about taking money and spending it on stuff that you and I probably wouldn't do. Okay, I mean, I'll pay for my own health care, but I don't want to pay for, you know, 15 other people's health care. Okay, so what the Constitution says about taxes, this is the real critical thing here. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. That means that politicians can't say, we don't like the people in New Hampshire, so we're going to double tax them, and we like the people in Colorado, so we're going to let them off. You know, whatever excise taxes there is, it has to be uniform throughout the United States. Whenever you buy a tire, you are paying a federal excise tax. And if you look for the bill of sale, they'll probably break it out on there and tell you what the federal tax is on that tire. And that's what an excise tax is. It's one of those things that you pay only when you buy something. If you don't want to pay tax, don't buy anything. Okay? Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. And it goes on and gives you a formula for how to calculate the population of the different states. So apportionment is when the government says we need $100 million, and that has to be apportioned among the states by population. So Rhode Island may have to come up with 1 million. California would come up with 30 million. Texas would come up with 25 million. You know, Washington State may come up with 8 million. Okay, but the apportionment is the federal government saying every state has to come up with this much money, and how you get it is your business, but you get it from your citizens, and then you pay it to the federal treasury. Okay, and the last section one here is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. In other words, any direct tax, which is a direct tax on your property, okay, in other words, your income is your property, your house is your property, all of that, any direct tax, the federal government cannot tax you directly according to the Constitution. Now they do that right now, but that's not constitutional. Okay, a direct tax has to be apportioned according to the Constitution. Okay, the income tax law of 1862 has a section here where it talks about apportionment. It says, "And be it further enacted that any state or territory and the District of Columbia may lawfully assume, assess, collect, and pay into the Treasury of the United States the direct tax or its quota thereof, imposed by this act upon the state, territory, or the District of Columbia in its own way and manner, by and through its own officers, assessors, and collectors." So what it's saying is that after the federal government has said that, you know, the District of Columbia has to come up with $10 million, the District of Columbia has to go to its citizens and say, this is how much you have to come up with. They have to figure out how to apportion, spread that tax around to everybody there in that state or whatever, you know, whether it's the District of Columbia or Wisconsin or whatever. Okay, now, what the 16th Amendment says, it says, "The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration." Now, the average person and virtually every lawyer you talk to, every tax professional you talk to, every judge, almost everyone you talk to is going to say, well, what that did was that eliminated the requirement for apportionment. And that's what everyone thinks the 16th Amendment says. Is everyone thinks the 16th Amendment abolished the requirement that direct taxes must be apportioned among the states, which then allows the government to tax citizens directly. So there was a decision in 1984 called Parker v. Commissioner, and the judges in the Parker court said, at this late date, it seems incredible that we would again be required to hold that the Constitution, as amended, empowers the Congress to levy an income tax against any source of income without the need to apportion the tax equally among the states, or to classify it as an excise tax applicable to specific categories of activities. In other words, they are saying that the constitutional provision or requirement for apportionment was negated by the 16th Amendment. That's what they're saying. And what they say is the way the IRS understands that requirement in the 16th Amendment. And it's also the same way most tax professionals, I would say virtually all tax professionals, and virtually all tax attorneys and virtually all judges understand it. And then it goes on to say, the Supreme Court promptly determined in Brushaber v. Union Pacific Railroad Company that the 16th Amendment provided the needed constitutional basis for the imposition of a direct, non-apportioned income tax. Okay, so the Parker Court is basically saying what virtually every tax professional, every tax attorney, every judge, every tax court believes, that there is no requirement for apportionment for the income tax. However, the Parker Court lies. What the Brushaber Court said, and you can look this up, you can look it up on your phone right now if you want to look up Brushaber v. Union Pacific, and you'll eventually find that decision. So it's a well written out decision. You can read the whole thing. Okay, said the Brushaber Court said, and I believe this was a unanimous decision, the 16th Amendment does not purport to confer power to levy income taxes in a generic sense, as that authority was already possessed, or to limit and distinguish between one kind of income tax and another. But its purpose is to relieve all income taxes when imposed from apportionment from consideration of a source whence the income is derived. In other words, after the federal government apportions the tax among the states, then the 16th Amendment applies to all sources of income. Okay, the Brushaber Court also said the confusion is not inherent, but rather arises from the conclusion, which the Parker Court made, that the 16th Amendment provides for a hitherto unknown power of taxation. That is, a power to levy an income tax which, although direct, should not be subject to the regulation of apportionment applicable to all other direct taxes. And therefore, if a tax is levied under its assumed authority, which the 16th Amendment's assumed authority, which does not partake of the characteristics exacted by the amendment, it is outside of the amendment and is void as a direct tax in the general constitutional sense because not apportioned. So the Brushaber Court, which rendered this decision in 1916, right after the income tax was implemented, is saying very clearly, and you can read it yourself, that the 16th Amendment does not eliminate the requirement for apportionment. So if the federal government wants to impose a direct tax, they must apportion it to be constitutional. Okay, so the bottom line is that any direct tax or capitation imposed by the federal government must be apportioned among the states. Okay, the income tax is illegal as currently understood by most people. Most people assume that the government has the right to impose a direct tax upon you as an individual. That is illegal. That's not through apportionment. And the Constitution says, and the Brushaber Court affirmed it, that any direct tax must be apportioned among the states. Okay, it's legal as implemented as long as the IRS stays within the law. If you've had a lot of dealings with the IRS, you'll find that in every communication they send to you in one way or another, there's a line in there that says, if you disagree with our assessment, you can call us or write us and tell us why you disagree with us. Okay, when you get a bill from AT&T, is there a little line on there that says, if you disagree with this bill, call us and tell us why you disagree? Is that on your mortgage statement? Is it on any bill you get from any service you receive from anybody? Does your mechanic give you that on your bill? If you disagree with this bill, tell us why you disagree. Why does the IRS always include that little statement on every communication? Because they don't have the right to demand that money from you. What they're doing is they're asking you to sign an affidavit. Their game is intimidation. Okay, Pete Hendrickson says in Cracking the Code, we have a bunch of books here too. The scheme is complex and artful. Because of the limitations of the federal taxing power, the government must somehow create a body of evidence from which to allege the untaxable activities are actually taxable activities before it can assert a claim of authority or legal interest. This is accomplished by inducing such persons to execute affidavits of various kinds which support presumptions that their payments or receipts occurred as federal or federally subordinate, i.e. territory possession, government workers, etc. In other words, they operate by affidavit. When you sign a 1040 form, that is an affidavit. You are saying, yea, verily, I owe tax on this money. And the IRS says, oh, since you said you owe tax on this money, we agree. You do owe that tax. And we're going to make sure you pay it. And we might even think you owe more. So what the income tax really is a tax on gains, profit, and income derived from the exercise of federal privilege. For example, mining on federal property. You know, if the federal government happens to own some property and allows a mining company to mine something on that property, whatever it is, that's the exercise of federal privilege. Railroad profits resulting from the use of federal lands. During the 1800s, the federal government ceded a whole bunch of land to railroads so they could build railroads all the way across the country. Wages and salaries of federal employees, like post office workers, you know, your postman. That's federal privilege. I mean, he's working for the federal government, and he wouldn't have that job without the federal government. United States corporations, and this is defined, you know, corporations that have a majority of federal employees on their boards or federally controlled, whatever it is. Anyway, they're controlled by federal government entities. And I don't know about defense contractors, that's another question. But it's about federal privilege. And Pete Hendrickson spent a lot of time going through the code, figuring out just what this was about. And I'm going to go into some really screwy stuff here in just a second. But federal privilege, you know, the law, tax law, defines a trade or business as performing the functions of a public office. Now, you and I do things like sell widgets or do services, you know, you work on HVAC, you build houses, whatever you do. Okay, but what you're doing is you're exchanging your labor or a product that you made for money, okay? That's not profit, that's an exchange, okay? You have the right to engage in that. And the Constitution and the law acknowledges that you have the right to do that. But federal privilege, for instance, you know, when a congressman or a congresswoman goes to Congress as a normal middle-class person and within 10 years they're worth $100 million, do you think they were exercising federal privilege to get all that money?
Yes, sir.
And like we just had this thing with Joe Biden and his son getting $83,000 a month on the board of some company in the Ukraine where he had absolutely no expertise in what that company did. And he got like $1.5 billion from China for something that he had absolutely no expertise in. Why did he get that? Do you think it was because his father's federal privilege? That's what the income tax is supposed to apply to. Congressmen, senators, judges, federal administrators should pay taxes on what they get from the federal government. Tax law was written to deceive you. Now, in section 7701, and you can look this up on your phone if you want, the term United States, when used in a geographical sense, includes only the states and the District of Columbia. Now, if you stop there, you'd think, well, only the states, that means, you know, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and all those places, and the District of Columbia. Except the next section defines state. The term state shall be construed to include the District of Columbia, where such construction is necessary to carry out provisions of this title. So the United States is the District of Columbia or the District of Columbia. However, if you assert that definition in your communications with the IRS, that is officially listed as a frivolous position. You're quoting the law, but it's a frivolous position. Other tax definitions of the United States applicable to section 8621. See if you can make sense out of this. In the case of any taxpayer with qualified business income from sources within the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, if all such income is taxable, and it goes on about, you know, for remuneration paid for services in Puerto Rico. That's a definition of the United States. Does that make any sense? Definition of the United States. How much sense does that make? Okay, other tax law definitions of the United States. The term United States, when used in a geographical sense, includes the seabed and subsoil of those submarine areas which are adjacent to the territorial waters of the United States and over which the United States has exclusive rights, etc., etc., etc. If you're like me, you're scratching your head and saying, what in the hell are they talking about? So the first thing you realize when you start reading through the tax law and seeing these screwy definitions, you start asking yourself, why in the hell are they defining things this way? Okay, now tax law definition of trade or business. And again, you can look this up on your phone right now if you want. The term trade or business includes the performance of the functions of a public office. And I've been back and forth with the IRS on this, and they acknowledge that this is the definition of trade or business as it applies to the law. Now, is selling widgets or engineering design or doing electrical work performing the functions of a public office? Is it? Does anybody think that makes any sense?
Says it includes that.
Well, it says includes the performance of the functions of public office. And like Pete Hendrickson told us, it is artfully written to suggest that it may include some other things too. But one of the, let's see, where am I? There's, well, we'll get into those things a little bit later. There are some certain, there are concepts of inclusio unius est exclusio alterius. In other words, when something is specifically mentioned, it necessarily excludes anything not mentioned. For instance, if a teacher goes out on the playground and says, all you kids come in here, does she also mean the teachers or anybody that's not a student that's standing around on the playground? No. She specifically means that the kids on the playground come in. Okay? She's not talking to anybody else on the playground. And the same thing applies to law. When the law specifically mentions something, for instance, trade or business, includes the performance of the functions of a public office, that is specifically what it means. A trade or business includes the performance of the functions of a public office. It doesn't include anything else. Okay, tax law definition of wages. For purposes of this chapter, the term wages means all remuneration, etc., 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 paid in any medium other than cash, etc. And it mentions employee, performed by an employee for his employer. And then it defines employee. For the purposes of this chapter, the term employee includes an officer, employee, or elected official of the United States. The official United States. This is law. A state, again, District of Columbia, or any political subdivision thereof, or the District of Columbia, or any agency or instrumentality of any one or more of the foregoing. The term employee also includes an officer of a corporation. Now, do you get, if you're an employee of a regular company doing something, does that fit you? No. I don't think it does.
No, it's not a corporation.
I don't think it does. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, here's the dodge. The law, tax laws, very studiously and deliberately deploy terms with unique custom definitions such as employee, trade or business, and United States. And that's in the book, and we have some books right here that you can get if you want. Okay, and this is what's really interesting. Taxable self-employment income. Gross income defined. Except as otherwise provided in this subtitle, gross income means all income from whatever source derived, including but not limited to the following terms: compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefits, and others. Gross income derived from business, and there's a whole list of stuff, okay? So that sounds like everything. And if you challenge the IRS in court, the judges will say, oh, Section 61 says, you know, gross income means everything, so everything you earn is taxable, you know? But if you go to Section 1402, it defines net earnings from self-employment. The term net earnings from self-employment means the gross income, see Section 61 up here, okay, derived by an individual from any trade or business carried on by such individual, less the deductions allowed, etc., etc. Okay, so that sounds like, you know, it could apply to any of us who run our own business. Except trade or business is defined as the performance of the functions of a public office. So if you're not performing the functions of a public office, you're not running a taxable business. This is the law. I mean, just read through it. I mean, you can read it yourself. I mean, you go to each section here. As a matter of fact, if you go to uscode.house.gov, it is the entire U.S. Code. And you can look up all these sections. This is all Title 26. Title 26, Section 61 will take you right here. Title 26, Section 1402 will take you right here. Okay? Okay, what the law means. And this, like Pete says, it is artfully and deceptively written. Okay, the terms includes and including, when used in a definition contained in this title, careful, shall not be deemed to exclude other things otherwise within the meaning of the term defined. Now, you could just say it means what it says, okay? But what it says, the terms includes and including, when used in a definition contained in this title, shall not be deemed to exclude other things, could be anything out there, otherwise within the meaning of the term defined, except that it says within the meaning of the term defined. Okay? So a trade or business is defined as including the performance of the functions of a public office. That's the term. And that's a term of art. Okay? So within the meaning of performing the functions of a public office includes what? What do public officials do? Do they do engineering design? Do they build houses? Do they sell widgets? Do they do HVAC work? Do they do what you're doing in your business? No. They perform the functions of a public office. So what they're doing is they're suggesting that whenever the law says includes something, it might mean something else. It might mean something completely outside of that. And there is a Latham decision where the court actually said that. They said that, well, this 7701C we take in an expansive manner. In other words, it means anything we want it to mean. It can mean performing the functions of a public office, but it could also mean engineering design, it could mean doing HVAC work, it could mean anything we want it to mean. And if you read decisions written by federal judges, that's exactly the tack they take. They say, well, section 7701C says, it's not going to exclude anything otherwise within the meaning of the term defined. So the meaning of the term defined is whatever we define it to be, so it means what you do, whatever it is. So the term is the performance of the functions of a public office. Within the meaning of the term is within the meaning of performing the functions of a public office. Otherwise, within the meaning of the term is within the meaning of performing the functions of a public office. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. It just means you have to sit down and look at it and say, what in the hell are they talking about? Okay, and the meaning of performing the functions of a public office does not encompass engineering design, selling widgets, or any other common business activity. But the courts think so. The judges think so. Tax court thinks so. I mean, they just read it however they want it and interpret it any way they like it. So in the interpretation of statutes levying taxes, it is the established rule not to extend their provisions by implication beyond the clear import of the language used, or to enlarge their operations so as to embrace matters not specifically pointed out. In case of doubt, they are construed most strongly against the government and in favor of the citizen. United States Supreme Court. Okay, is that what they do? No. Okay, fundamental legal concepts. Inclusio unius est exclusio alterius. The inclusion of one is the exclusion of another. If you have the certain designation of one person is an absolute exclusion of all others. If you say all engineers, you're meaning all engineers. You're not including plumbers and air conditioning mechanics or car mechanics or anybody else. You're specifically excluding anybody that is not an engineer. Okay, this doctrine decrees that where law expressly describes a particular situation to which it shall apply, an irrefutable inference must be drawn that what is omitted or excluded was intended to be omitted or excluded. And that's the way you have to read the tax law, because a tax law is artfully and deceptively written. Okay, and a term of art, a statutorily defined term that has a custom definition with regard to the law and a completely different meaning in common usage. When you and I talk about a trade or business, we're talking about selling widgets, running a store, driving a truck, whatever it is, okay? That's what we're talking about when we say trade or business. The law, tax law, specifies a trade or business is performing the functions of a public office. If driving a truck is performing the functions of a public office, then driving a truck is taxable activity. Okay, this is what the courts have done. If we take this big old green circle as the Constitution and the limits of the Constitution, what the courts are supposed to do when you get questions, and if you're an attorney or if you've dealt with difficult situations before, you understand that there are situations where you're trying to do the right thing, but it's just not clear what the right thing is. And you have to sit down and really wrestle with it and try to figure out what is the right thing in this particular situation. So what the courts are supposed to do is they're supposed to interpret these dicey situations and define the fuzzy edges of the Constitution in these different places. But what they've done, like the Parker Court and the Latham Court and a bunch of other courts, have interpreted the Constitution. They start within the Constitution and they just pull concepts out of their rear end and say, oh, well, that means this. And they get outside the Constitution. And then you get another court that says, well, the Latham Court said this, so that means, these other things, logically from what they said, we can conclude this other stuff. And you end up with court decisions that are completely outside the Constitution. I mean, they have no validity as far as the Constitution is concerned. Trouble is, the courts are the enforcement mechanism, and they impose this stuff on us. I mean, they rendered a decision against me on July 9th, and the judge, or judges, I think there was 3 of them, they quoted section 7701C, like I just showed you a little bit earlier, is that, including me is not meant to exclude whatever it is. But anyway, they basically said, the law doesn't mean what it says because of this section of law. And you would think a professional judge would be able to discern what the law says and be concerned about being consistent with the Constitution and what the law says. But they're not. They just go off and, Pete Hendrickson on his website has a section called Weed Whackers, where he goes in and he analyzes what some of these courts have said and says, well, this is what the Constitution says, this is what the law says, and then this is what the court said. And it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, they go off into the weeds. But that's what they impose on us. Okay, now, the important thing. A country is defined by the laws it enforces. And what has happened is an unconstitutional understanding of tax law has been imposed upon us and enforced upon us. And if the courts and law enforcement systems that we have enforce something other than the law or the Constitution, what they enforce becomes the law. Okay? And this is what's important. What defines a country? What defines a country is the customs, traditions, and rules of practice that that country practices as codified into law. Only those laws that are enforced have any effect on defining a country. Now, if everybody in the country understands the law to mean something, it will generally be enforced the way everybody understands it. But when we delegate that enforcement to a body that's officially supposed to enforce that law, and somebody gets into that enforcement body and says, well, I'd like something else to happen than what everybody wants to happen, and I'd like to enforce something different. And they start enforcing something different and imposing it on people. Well, we've delegated that enforcement mechanism to enforce the law upon us, except they're enforcing something other than what we told them to enforce. Okay, a law is structured according to language, grammar, and logic. Without language, grammar, and logic, law is meaningless. It is completely meaningless. If grammar doesn't hold and give you the rules of understanding the language, and logic doesn't hold, telling you how to reason and get from A to B to C to D, you can't make any sense of anything. Law is implemented by processes and procedures as determined by the legislature. Legislatures are set in place to take our Constitution and codify it into law saying that whenever we get into this situation, this is how we're going to apply the principles enshrined in the Constitution. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to write laws that enforce the Constitution. And the processes and procedures are explained and enforced by the courts. So our founding fathers wrote a Constitution, and they did a very good job, I think, of writing the Constitution. And they set up a legislature which is supposed to write laws to enforce the Constitution and apply it to every situation that we get into. And then we have courts that are supposed to interpret that law. Because, as I said before, there are frequently situations where it's not perfectly clear just what the law says. So you need courts to look at the law and say, okay, in this situation, what does that law mean? And then you have law enforcement that physically enforces the law on the population of the country. And we want that. Okay, we want that. We want law enforcement to physically enforce the law so everybody obeys the law that we all agree on. Okay. So the problem is that the people understand the law one way, but the courts and official government agencies, for example, the IRS, understand it another way. The IRS's understanding of the law pretty much is what gets imposed upon us, despite the fact that the IRS lies repeatedly. The only solution to that situation is for the people to force the government to follow the law the way they understand it. And the mechanism that is in place for that is free elections, is we elect people who do what we want. We need to demand that the people we represent force the system to enforce the Constitution the way we understand it, not the way they'd like it to be. Okay? So what we have to do is make sure that the people running for office represent our point of view and the way we understand things, and we need to jump all over them until they get off on the law enforcement mechanism in the courts and make them follow the law. Okay, the IRS generally follows the law, not always, not always, but they generally follow the law. They publish regulations that make the law easy to understand the way they understand it. They're very, very careful to stay within the law while they deceive you into believing the law says what they want you to believe it says, but it really doesn't. They'll mention trade or business, United States, and all that, knowing that you're going to understand those things in one way while the law defines it a completely different way. They want you to assume the common meaning of terms while the law provides custom definitions that mean completely different things. The current implementation of the tax law, Title 26, depends on affidavits. When you sign an IRS form, you're legally swearing that what you put on that form is absolutely true. So be careful what you agree to. 1099 forms are for trade or business reporting only. And if you look at the instructions for the 1099, it emphasizes in boldface, trade or business reporting only. Personal payments are not reportable. Why do you think they said that? Because they want you to understand that your trade or business, whatever it is taxable, but really they're emphasizing it because the law says a trade or business is performing the functions of a public office. But they're not going to tell you that. You have to figure that out. Okay, does your business perform the functions of a public office? Where does tax law define trade or business as anything other than includes the performance of the functions of a public office? It doesn't. Now, you're going to find regulations that the IRS publishes where they list all kinds of occupations and all kinds of things like that. And in their regulations, they're assuming that you're assuming that trade or business is anything you do, when it really isn't. So what they're doing is they're artfully creating a situation where you get led into thinking that anything is taxable when there's only certain things that are taxable. Did you really earn any wages that are truly taxable? Okay, what happened when I challenged the IRS? Okay, I filed my first educated 1040 form in July 2014 for the 2013 tax year. I'd read Pete Hendrickson's book, Cracking the Code, probably 3 or 4 or 5 times by then. Because you need to, because the first time you read it, the FUD is just so thick that you think, this doesn't make any sense. But when you start reading it, and you actually start looking at what the law says, and it starts making sense, you start realizing that, you know, I don't really owe any taxes. So I filed my first educated form in July 2014. I got an extension that year because I was thinking about it still. So anyway, nothing happened until October 2015. I got a series of demand letters and deficiency notices for the next few years. I promptly responded to each one. What they do is they'll send you what I call a boo letter. It says, notice of deficiency, intent to levy. You owe us $30,000, pay it right now, you know. Pay us in 30 days or really bad things are going to happen, or we're going to take your property and your house and your car, and we're going to cost you a lot of money and throw you in jail and all kinds of really rotten things, man. I mean, they really try to scare you. And I will say it's unnerving. It's not, my fight has been peaceful, but it's been unnerving. I mean, getting nasty letters like that from the IRS is not what I would call pleasant. But nothing happened until October 15th, so that's about 15 months later. I got a series of demand letters and deficiency notices for the next few years. I promptly responded to each one. They'll usually give you about 30 days to respond. And in every one of them, it's, you know, you owe us all this money, we've determined that you owe all this. But if you disagree, write us a letter or call us and tell us why you disagree. And eventually, I got a 3219A notice of deficiency on May 16, 2016 that I did not respond to within 90 days. 3219A is where they tell you, this is your final notice of deficiency, and you've got 90 days to petition the tax court. So I petitioned the tax, well, I didn't petition the tax court that time. So I still got a bunch of nasty letters, but still, you know, I didn't get any visits from the IRS. I didn't get any calls from them. Just nasty letters. They like to send nasty letters. And I actually talked to somebody in the bowels of the IRS once who seemed very knowledgeable and said that there's this massive mechanized letter writing system where they periodically pump out just huge millions of letters. So if you feel like you're talking to a machine when you write to the IRS, that might be true. So anyway, I didn't respond to that, which I shouldn't have, because, which I should have, I guess. But the IRS assumes that if you don't respond within a specified time, you admit that you owe what they say you owe. And that's what happened on that 3219A, but I still never agreed with them. And they kept sending me letters, nasty letters. You know, they just keep on sending them. And I replied to each one, said, no, I don't owe you any money. Eventually had a Cdp hearing, which is a collection due process hearing, which was a phone call from the IRS, where they try to be nice and they say, you know, well, if you really cooperate, we can make this easy on you, you know, and we can work something out and stuff like that. And I told them, I don't owe you anything, and I'm never going to agree to any assessment that you make. And, you know, they get a little huffy or whatever. And they sent me a letter in March of 2019 and gave me 30 days to file a petition with the tax court, which I did. I filed a petition on March 15, 2019, this year. The IRS responded with their response to my petition on May 7, 2019. And if you sign up on my sign-up sheet, I'll send you all these communications back and forth so you can see what my petition was, what their response was, and my response to their petition was, and then what the result is. Okay, so the IRS responded. Basically, they denied everything I said in my petition. I basically said, I don't owe you any money, and this is why. And they said, we deny, basically. So I filed a response to their response on June 20th, and I said, I deny your denial. In each case, and this is why I deny your denial. And fundamentally what I said in my original petition is that you cannot quote the law concerning wages, because I had wages in 2013, as it applies to me, using all of the terms of art in the law, such that it makes any grammatical or logical sense and applies to me. And that was back in March 15 that I filed that petition, and I challenged them to that. They have yet to quote the law as it applies to me or as it makes any sense. I haven't heard from the court since I filed my response to the IRS in late June of this year. I don't think they can respond. They cannot quote the law. And you can do this as an exercise for yourself. Look up section 3401A of Title 26 or 3121A of Title 26 and see if you can follow that law through with all of the links, because it starts, you know, it says things like, well, in this section over here is where it defines this, so you have to go to that section, and then that section says, well, you have to go to this section, and that section says, well, you have to go to this section, and it just keeps going around and around and around and around. And you can't get to the point where it makes any sense. You can't make any sense of it. And you cannot quote that law for any specific situation such that it makes any grammatical or logical sense. It can't, it doesn't. I challenge anybody to do it. The IRS can't do it. This is what my 2013 1040 form, I don't know if you can see it really well. There's a lot of zeros there. I had some unemployment compensation, and I had some wages, and I paid taxes on wages. That's federal withholding. It's like $511. And I said, bottom line, I don't owe you anything. Zero. And when I challenged the wages, I filled out a 4852 form. That's the standard way of rebutting a W-2. And it says this is what the W-2 form said, and this is the corrected form, zeros. And then they ask you, how did you determine the amounts on lines 7 and 8 above up here? And I said the company provided a W-2 which erroneously alleged payments of Internal Revenue Code section 1401, 3121, 3401 and 3121 wages disputed. I dispute those things. Okay, and then it says, explain your efforts to obtain Form W-2 or whatever, and I said none. The W-2 was issued before errors were noticed. The amounts withheld were correct. Okay, so I filed that, and this is what I should have filed. I didn't rebut my original 1099s, but this has a rebuttal form here which says this corrected 1099 is submitted to rebut a document known to have been submitted by the party identified above as payer, which erroneously alleges a payment to the party identified above as the recipient of gains, profit, or income made in the course of a trade or business. Again, trade or business is performing the functions of a public office, which I didn't do.
Does that form have a number to it there?
1099.
That's a part of a 1099?
This is a 1099 right here.
Okay, but it's not a complete...
Well, you don't see 1099, but that's the 1099. Okay, so anyway, I rebutted that, and this is an affidavit. I'm saying, yea, verily, this is a true statement. And this is what they send you. Okay, they'll say proposed amount due, $2,615. Does AT&T send you a bill with a proposed amount due? Does your mortgage company send you a bill with a proposed amount due? I don't think so. But the IRS does. Proposed amount due. And it says, if our information is correct, you will owe $2,615, including interest. Okay, and then it says over here, if you agree with the changes we made, which means I might disagree. It tells you what to do. If you don't agree with the changes, complete the response form on page 5 and send it to us along with a signed statement and any documentation that supports your claim, so we receive it by November 18, 2015, which I did. And here's some more of the form. Explanation of changes, you know, and they'll go through all this stuff. They try to make it official looking. See, it's shown on your return as corrected by the IRS. Okay, so they corrected it. Okay, according to what law did they correct it? What law makes me liable for that amount of tax? They don't say. They just say, well, we just pulled this out of our rear end and said you owe us this money. And what they do is they depend on the 1099 forms or whatever. They'll go to the 1099 form, and they just assume that that's right. But a 1099 form is a third-party testimonial that is not signed. Okay, so if you go to court, can you submit third-party testimonial that is not signed and have it be legal evidence in court?
No.
I don't think you can. Okay, but they do it all the time. They just do this all the time. They just say, you owe us all this money. There's a 1099 form that says you made this money. It's taxable. And we say it's taxable. So they do that. And then, okay, what do they do here? But anyway, this is, they go through all this stuff. But what they've come to start doing is, it used to be that they would clearly say, you can write to us, if you disagree, you can write to us and tell us why you disagree with supporting documentation. They've begun to take that off of the forms and just say, call us. If you disagree, call us. Well, if you call them, you're going to be on the phone for 53 minutes and nobody's going to pick it up. But there is a taxpayer bill of rights, and they'll send you a taxpayer bill of rights, and it says that you have the right to challenge determinations of the IRS. So I assert my right to challenge the IRS in a letter that I can write and send to them and say, what you're saying is wrong. It's not true. Here's some useful websites. The entire U.S. code is at this website, uscode.house.gov. It's just a raw text website. You can search it. General law and U.S. code law.cornell.edu. But even on this website, if you look up the 16th Amendment, they will tell you the 16th Amendment eliminated the need for apportionment. Like every tax attorney and every tax professional will tell you. The truth about the income tax, losthorizons.com. This is Pete Hendrickson's website, and he's got lots of information on how to fight the IRS. And this is just another one I found. It's got some good information on it. And there's lots more. And if you believe that we owe taxes, that it's legal for the IRS to impose direct taxes on us, freedomlawcenter.com has a challenge, three-part challenge, worth $300,000, $100,000 each. First of all, if you can prove that the 16th Amendment was legally and properly ratified, you get $100,000. Number two, if you can prove there's a law that says every American citizen owes income tax, they'll give you $100,000. And there's a third provision, I don't know what it is, but it's worth $100,000. So if you think that there is a law that makes us liable for income tax, you can make yourself a quick $300,000. Go for it. And there's not only that, there's at least another $50,000 challenge. And there's two agents that I know, I'm sure there's many more, Joe Bannister and Sherry Peel Jackson. Sherry Peel Jackson was a former IRS agent who worked for the IRS. And she saw a challenge in a newspaper where they said, prove to us that there is a law that makes Americans liable for income tax and we'll give you $50,000. And she thought, hey man, I'm going to make a quick $50,000. Well, after 2 weeks of digging through the tax code, and she knew the tax code, she was an IRS agent after all, she couldn't find the law that makes Americans liable for the income tax. Same thing with Joe Bannister. And there's many more agents, I'm sure, that have done the same thing, who work for the IRS. So anyway, that's basically my talk, and I guess I'm open to questions.
Who wants to be first?
When you go to a tax preparer, one of the first things they'll bring up is Title 26, Section 6002, 6011, and 6012, and they'll tell you, well, that explains the tax right there. Have you looked at that? Do you have a response?
I'm sure I have looked at it, but basically, the way the tax law is written is it applies to taxpayers.
Taxpayers.
Taxpayers, right. And
He wins the correct.
And if you're a taxpayer and you're liable for tax, all of that stuff applies. But the distinction, the way it's written, is you have to be. It's like walking through a minefield. You have to look at the law, and then you have to look at the definitions in the law and be really careful about understanding what it actually says.
Ken, very good
Mm-hmm.
presentation, by the way. I have two concerns of what you said about, and so therefore I'd like you to clarify for me. I don't have a problem with the fact that it says trade or business, including public office, whatever the verbiage was, because I interpret that to mean federal employees are not exempt, obviously,
Right.
from paying income
Right, yeah.
tax. Okay, senators, presidents, what have you. Current one, of course, doesn't. But the other thing, when you spoke to apportionment, and you had indicated, we were an agrarian society
Right.
for a long, long time.
Right. Yeah.
But by the time we got to certainly the beginning of the 20th century, we were no longer as agrarian as we used to be, because you had the robber barons well in place
Right.
at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So, and which I think also led to why this, personally, my knowledge of history indicates why the 16th Amendment came to pass anyhow, because these guys weren't paying a penny in tax.
Mm-hmm.
When you speak to apportionment going prior to the 20th century, when the Constitution was put together, it really wasn't, and it was supposed to be based on census and so on and so forth. Well, really, if you look at it, the South was getting away with a very lenient treatment as it relates to apportionment, as to them paying their fair share, because it says 3 persons.
Yeah.
So the census really wasn't truly taken. I don't even know how they began to report slaves being 3/5 a person. I don't know what a census document looked like back then, or what have you, but I think that it would be safe to say that there were probably, in certain states, more slaves than there were white people that were, enslaving them. So how do you come to grips with that?
Well, I don't know, but
unfair apportionment.
well, I believe the slaves being 3/5 of a person was a concession to the people who wanted to eliminate slavery, because
Well, I know how it came about.
I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on that issue, but I believe that the slave states, I think South Carolina in particular, were very adamant about maintaining their hold on slavery. And I'm not sure, I don't know if they wanted to count slaves as one person or full person or whatever. But my understanding, it's very limited understanding, is that the 3/5 of a person was a compromise between those who wanted to eliminate slavery and those who wanted to maintain slavery.
No, I understand that, but
Yeah.
I'm speaking to apportionment.
Well, I don't know exactly how that works, but I know that if you study the 1862 law, they had a lot of discussion about apportionment, because there were like eastern states that had high populations that were very dense, where the apportionment wouldn't be too bad because everybody had like a smaller amount of land. And then you had the western states where you had a few people owning a lot of land, and if they were taxed according to the land they had, they would bear a much heavier burden on that. So there were a lot of discussions about that concerning the 1862 law, or even the 1861 law, I'm not sure. So there are issues with apportionment. I mean, it's not just, let's do it this way and that's all there is to it. There are lots of issues you have to wrestle with. But the point I'm making is that the Supreme Court has held, and the Constitution says, that any direct tax must be apportioned.
Yeah. But the 16th Amendment.
Well, the 16th Amendment does not only applies after apportionment is applied, according to the Supreme Court, not according to the other courts. According to the Supreme Court, it applies only after apportionment.
Okay. And my last question. You indicate, you're making out as if the IRS is the bad guy here.
Mm-hmm.
The IRS is our administrators. They're implementing laws that your elected officials have voted on.
Well,
IRS rules come out of our Congress.
Well,
not
they're
the
implementing
IRS.
their understanding of the laws.
Yes, but the
they're-
packages are very well written by Congress. Or lawful.
Well, it's artfully written by Congress.
Yeah, okay, so I wouldn't put the blame on the poor little clerks at IRS.
Well, there's a whole lot of issues there. But anyway, let's get somebody else.
Hi, I had a couple questions. Your contention is that Bruce Haber upheld direct taxes.
Brush-Haber upheld the income tax if any direct tax was apportioned. It's saying that the tax is legal, a direct tax is legal as long as it's apportioned first. Then the 16th Amendment applies.
I believe the decision in Brush-Haber was that the 16th Amendment overturns any of those restrictions because it is not apportioned, and that's been a decision that has been held up for, let me see, this year is 2016, that's about 103 years.
Well, then you're agreeing with the Parker Court. You need to read the Brush-Haber decision. Read the Brush-Haber decision.
Well, I know several of Supreme Courts that have read it and upheld it.
Well, right, the Brush-Haber decision, but that upholds the requirement for apportionment. What you're saying is that the 16th Amendment eliminates the requirement for apportionment. According to the Supreme Court, it does not.
Well, that's been United States law for since the 16th Amendment was ratified.
Well, it has been assumed to be United States law. The Supreme Court says clearly in the Brush-Haber decision, as I showed you earlier, that only after apportionment does the 16th Amendment apply.
I understand. My last question was, if you have been describing this legal process with the IRS, and I was wondering, had you actually won a decision in a United States court of law? Thank you.
Okay, well, the first thing you have to realize is that the IRS will never admit it's wrong. Neither will the tax court ever admit it's wrong. However, on my 2013 taxes here, I filed my response to the IRS's response on June 20th, challenging them to quote the law as it applies to me, so it makes some grammatical or logical sense, and they haven't done it.
Right.
They haven't done it since March 15th.
But my question was whether you had actually won a...
Well, I mean, what constitutes a win? When you're fighting the IRS, if they just leave you alone for a long time, that's pretty much a win, because they'll never admit they're wrong.
Forgive me, sir, but in our system, the Constitution states that a win is when a decision is uttered by a judge who was nominated and confirmed by the
Well,
United
you're
States Senate and
assuming the
appointed by
legal
the
system
President of the United
works the
States.
way we want it to. It doesn't.
That works in a criminal context.
Yes.
There's no criminal situation.
As far as the Bruce-Haber decision, if you read the decision, the judge in Bruce-Haber declared that the 16th Amendment created no new taxing authority.
Right, that's correct.
It's a very important word.
That is correct.
Ken, have you filed First off, why did you even bother to file the 1014?
Okay,
The
okay.
2013,
This is
number
good.
one, and number two, have you filed any since that time, or you're just hanging out there waiting?
Oh, I've filed every year since 2015.
You have, so why
Yeah.
bother if you, for the, you know, you obviously have shown them you
Well,
have intent with
okay.
their authority.
Okay, one thing you have to remember, if you study tax cases, what seems to get the IRS into violent mode is when people don't file and brag about it. Irwin Schiff did that. He wrote 7 books about the IRS, and I think he did some very good legal analysis. But he didn't file, and he said, I don't need to file. And he ended up in jail and died in jail at 90-some years old. I think everything they did with him was completely illegal and wrong and criminal, but that's the case. If you want to see just how nasty the IRS can be, look up Gordon Kahl, K-A-H-L, and find out his story. They basically, you know, he said, I'm not going to file. He didn't do it for 9 years, and then got on a radio show and said, this is what I'm doing, and apparently that just put the IRS into violent mode, and they went after him, and eventually, this is my understanding, you need to read the story to get the thing, but they attacked him, chopped his arms and legs off with axes, then burned him to death, and then found out they got the wrong guy, and then they got the right guy and did the same thing. So if you want the IRS to get violent, don't file and brag about it.
Now, I understand that, but you do comply with some of
Well,
the
okay,
rules.
I'm doing a legal process. So what I'm doing is I'm saying I'm filing, and I'm saying I don't owe you any money, and this is why.
Yeah.
And they come back with all kinds of letters, you know, nasty boo letters, and I respond to each one, and they respond back, and I respond back to them. And this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it gets to the point where you get a 3219A or something that says you have to file a petition with the tax court, and that's when you file a petition with the tax court. And if you've developed a good legal argument, you can beat them. And I think I beat them on 2013 because if they had a response, they would have responded by now, and they haven't. And that tells me they don't have a response. They cannot quote the law the way I asked them to quote it.
But as it relates to apportionment and your stand on that subject,
It's just,
since tax rates are set by income level, okay, why can't you accept the percentages that are attached to individual incomes in their various brackets?
Well,
As
because
being a fair apportionment.
Well, that's apportionment is the federal government going to the states and saying the states owe us money, which has nothing to do with marginal
Why
rates.
can't you translate that to individual apportionment?
Well, because the states, if the government said Texas has to come up with $30 million, then Texas has to discuss among our legislature, how are we going to come up with $30 million? But it's up to the Texas legislature to figure out how they're going to do that. I mean, they could sell something, they could say, you know, you owe us this much for whatever and all that, and then, but see, that puts it closer to you and me because we directly elect our legislators. And if they start trying to tax us in ways we don't like, we can go right to them and say, hey, you know, don't do this.
Yeah, but they don't do anything about it anyhow.
Well, that's something I'm trying to change here.
I mean, our property taxes are outrageous.
Uh-huh.
As far as Irwin Schiff, he was the zero tax return guy, if you will recall. He did recommend filing.
Well,
He was filing a zero tax return because the way he figured it is you had no individual.
Well, I read in his books where he said he regretted telling other people not to file because they ended up in jail too. So, but anyway, I haven't read all of Irwin Schiff's books. I've only read part of one. So anyway.
You'd mentioned Joe Bannister. I know he's very famous on YouTube, and he was in charge of the criminal division of the IRS. and was listening to a program like yours
Mhm.
and challenged them to say, hey, send me the information, I'll look at it. Looked at it for 2 years, went to his bosses, and then immediately they fired him.
Mhm.
I know it cost him $200,000, but he beat the IRS.
Mhm.
And he said after it was all said and done, he said the entire IRS is set up on fraud and deception.
That's exactly right. And that's what I said. It's artfully and deceptively written. The whole tax law is artfully, and if you want to get a better sense of that, read Larkin Rose. He's got a 25-page paper that's on the internet, the Larkin Rose on the internet, on the tax law. And he explains basically the criminal nature of the way they've written the law.
I bought lunch for Larkin Rose at one meeting. I just wanted to bring up the fact that even Larkin Rose went to jail.
I know a lot of people do. I haven't gone to jail, at least not yet.
So, just, I hope this is a question, but there's also a lot, I mean, Ken has had that partial success point. There's tons of people that have gotten money back.
That's correct.
There's a boatload of people that are getting checks, and you can see on losthorizons.com, the letter's very similar to what Ken wrote, and then the response from the IRS was, here's your money back, here's all that we withheld for the year.
Mhm.
Over and over. I'm one of those people.
Right.
I didn't, not from the IRS, but I got it back from the state, one of the states, and I'm in a similar situation with Ken. But the thing is that, and hopefully this is supporting, it boils down to it's an excise tax at the end of the day.
Right, that's what it
Because
is.
they can't make it a portion direct tax.
Right, yes.
So that's why, it isn't like a typo that it says trade or business.
No,
It
it's
literally
not.
is, they had the law to be constitutional, they had to make it apply to people in privileged situations that are, so it is, therefore it is an excise. That was the method for complying. Do I have time left?
No, I was just,
Oh,
I have a question.
Okay, gotcha. So,
And
so
this is
the,
a question.
yeah, and so, that's kind of an important basis to understand, is Ken's right in saying, oh, this is artful and all that stuff. But it's
Mhm.
artful in a sense that they are really trying, like you said, man, about trying to do the right thing and say, at the end of the day, it's said the right way, it applies to the right people, but we just don't tell us that.
You're right, they don't tell us
The news
that.
doesn't tell us that.
Right.
But the law actually, it does apply to the right people.
Right, and Pete has he's got like 250,000 examples of people that have gotten money back. So this is not an isolated thing.
One question that has kind of been bandied around here without being spoken. To my understanding, and please give me your word on this, has there ever been, other than the Ninth Circuit's opinion, but has there ever been a direct tax levied by the states in the whole history?
Yes, in 1862, the direct tax was apportioned. It was levied as an apportioned tax.
So that was once.
That was once, right. Well, I don't know, it may have happened again. I mean, it probably has happened once or twice other than that, but it's not very common, and the IRS doesn't like that kind of thing because it takes their power away. Anybody else?
I know there's a very good documentary called Freedom to Fascism.
Yes, Aaron Russo.
Russo.
And I saw that right after that came out at the Angelica, I think, on Mockingbird.
Russo.
Whatever, Russo, whatever his name is.
That's what he said.
Whatever, Aaron Russo. But Freedom to Fascism. It's a good movie to watch.
Have you made any friends in the IRS?
No, but I will say that I have apologized to one person, Christine L. Davis, who is famous for sending out frivolous notices, accusing people of filing frivolous notices, and I accused her of making up the fact that I filed in July of 2014, and when I went back and checked my records, it appears that that's exactly what I did. So I wrote her an apology to say, I'm sorry for accusing you of something you didn't do. So I don't know if that made her friendly to me or not. I rather doubt that it changed her mind. I think she is a machine. Yeah.
I've been following this weekend for a little bit, and I imagine you've gone through a bit. People are pretty much claiming it's suicide. You've been up against a lot. Every turn I see this go through, I see it evidence to me that it holds water. in spite of what other people try to say against. I believe this is really working out. Every turn you guys take, I see evidence that it works. I want to say thank you, Ken, for being one of the people to stick your neck up, stick it out, stick your head up, and take a shot. A lot of us haven't quite gotten this bold enough yet.
In response to that, I want to say that taking on the IRS is not for the weak of knees or the faint of heart. If you're not ready for a fight with a poisonous snake, then don't do it. Okay? But you know, if you sign up on that sign-up sheet, I'll send you like monthly updates on my situation, what's happened to me, legal strategies that I've done, and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And just to let you know, yeah, and Drew has books here. These are $20, I believe.
Yeah, I spent over that, but I'm willing to sell.
Yeah, we're going to sell them for $20, and this gives you the legal analysis of the book. Pete Hendrickson went through the code and found out what it says, and he was able to do it digitally, which makes it possible to do, where you can find all the sections. And what they do is they'll define something in section 61, they'll use it in section 1402, which is 1,300 and some sections later, and then use a definition that's 5,000 sections after that. So it's very helpful, and I will say that if you get the book, you need to read it 3 to 5 times for it to sink in. I mean, he's got a good legal analysis there, but to get through that wall of fear, obfuscation, and doubt, it takes a few times until you finally start realizing, you know, this is what it says.
Ken, you had indicated before that, if I understood you at the very beginning, you didn't have a problem paying certain taxes of some sort, or that you certainly don't, you don't want to be paying for anyone else's health care, you want to pay for your own,
Well,
on your own. So when do you think taxes are
Legitimate?
serve a purpose? Yes. And
Well, taxes are legitimate
Just
as long as they're legal and done properly. Now, other countries do things differently. I mean, our country was founded on the concept of individual freedom. And I do not agree with socialism or communism or any government-imposed set of things where I am forced to pay for something that somebody else wants. Because the fundamental concept of government is that, you know, government is the authority that imposes things on all of us for our own good. But what the people who say that forget is that government is people. And those people who run the government impose their understanding of the law on us. And that's why we end up with Venezuela and Cuba and places like that. Because they're doing it for the good of the people and in their concept, and everyone ends up poor.
All right, so I would disagree. The United States is not a Venezuela or a Russia.
I don't
or
want
what
to
have
become
you,
one.
And we're not even on our way there, okay? Until we remove some corruption from our own government, okay? So given that attitude, okay, you know, how do you propose the roads be built? Or have you already tarred?
Well, how did we survive?
Of your house?
How did
I mean,
we survive for 130 years without an income tax?
Well, we had dirt roads to begin with.
Well, but we
had little
built
trails that were
the
built.
world's greatest economy during that time with customs duties and excise taxes. The government can impose customs duties and excise taxes out the wazoo to make all the money we need, and we'll end up with surpluses rather than deficits.
Well,
and they without taxing us individually.
We have tariffs in play.
That's right.
Now,
Right.
that are the same as customs excise.
Well, that's what tariffs are. Tariffs are customs duties.
Understand that. That ain't working out too well for us.
Yes, it is.
Well, you
We're
think
bringing
so.
in billions of dollars, and inflation has not gone up.
Yeah, well, the point is though that you, Because the government's also trying to backfill some industries, i.e. the farmers.
Well, the fact
But
is
it
that
turns out they're just only
the fact is our
giving
economy is
money
exploding right now, and we're getting billions of dollars from China, and inflation hasn't gone up.
Well, because certain actions have been taken to control it. Whether
Well,
it be lowering
well,
the Fed recently.
Trump's doing a pretty good
But
job of
that's
getting the
no
economy
different
going.
than China devaluing its own currency.
Well, they can do whatever they want.
Devaluing our
China can do whatever they want.
Another question.
Yeah, but, well.
Well, I don't want to get into an argument about socialism.
No.
I mean, I completely disagree with socialism, but anyway.
What?
Oh.
Well, he wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, okay,
Don't talk so loud. I apologize.
go ahead.
U.S. total revenue on customs duties amounted to $41 billion in 2018, and total federal outlays were roughly $4 trillion
Okay.
as of this last year. So I was wondering where you were planning on making up the other 99%.
Well, there's government numbers are all kinds of screwy. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an economist.
And you're not responsible to.
You're right, but I don't need to be paying income tax to cover that.
Before NAFTA got kicked in the last year reporting 1998, we brought in $483 billion from tariffs.
Just 3.6 trillion to go.
Well, I mean, still, if you bring that forward into today's dollars, that would probably do a lot towards it.
Well, I don't want to get into this. The fact is, our government lasted 130 years with no income tax and did very well, had more surpluses than deficits.
Just to kind of get in that same space, this talk or this conversation can very easily leak over to political stuff. It's a question. So how do you help prevent it being a political argument, make it more just legal?
Well, okay, but this is about fundamental.
How do you help people not get political?
It's a fundamental argument about individual rights. Is like if the income tax is not, if I am not required to pay income tax, I don't want to pay income tax.
Exactly.
Period. It's not my business to make the government work. It's the government's business to figure out how to deal with things. It's my business to defend my rights. And I'm not taking responsibility for everything out there. I'm just saying I'm not paying taxes because I don't owe any taxes.
I wonder how many employees there are in the IRS. It seems so much money's paid out to these employees. If we eliminate that, maybe. Yeah.
Well, boy, it'd sure save a lot of trouble, wouldn't it? We got rid of all them.
Yeah, that's true.
Ken, I think you're aware that the Internal Revenue Service was put in as a collection agency for the for the Federal Reserve. Because before the Federal Reserve, the Treasury produced all the money the government used with no interest because it came from itself.
Right.
When it went to this private bank, the Federal Reserve, and it is a private bank owned by the Rockefellers and 10 European families, they started charging interest on all the money loaned to the government.
That's correct.
What are we going to do to get rid of this scheme where the IRS is just a collection agency for an interest rate we never had before
Well,
it came along?
I don't know that I can answer that, but since you raised that point, if we're talking about trillions and trillions of government debt, most of that is interest generated by the Federal Reserve.
That's right.
Back some years ago, I think it was the 80s, Bill Benson and Martin Red Beckman came out with a book called The Law That Never Was.
Right.
In which they went to all the states and they documented that the 16th Amendment had never been lawfully ratified.
Right.
Were you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of that, and that's a good point. And Freedom Law Center has a challenge. that if you can prove that the 16th Amendment was properly ratified, you get $100,000. Go for it.
I think we're running out of questions.
No, we're not running out of questions.
You just had one.
One of the factors that hasn't been spoken about here is whenever they do a substitute for return, which is kind of a term, I think I'm referring to what you received when they did your return for you.
They've never done that.
They've never done that?
They've never
Okay,
done that.
They've done that.
They don't
for
like to
other
do that.
people I know.
They don't like to do that because they're sticking their neck out when they do that.
Yeah, they are, because then you can request an agent's signature on who
Yeah,
did that.
yeah, they don't like to stick their neck out like that.
And so my question is whether you were familiar with the assessment process.
I'm not familiar with that much. All I know is that I started by filing and saying, I don't owe you any taxes. They respond with boo letters one after the other. I respond to their letter. They go back to me. It goes back and forth. It goes to tax court, and it goes to petition, and you can appeal to the appeals court if you want. Go.
How many people are fighting the income tax, would you say right now?
I don't know the actual numbers, but Pete Hendrickson says there's at least 250,000 people that he's got examples of on his website that have got refunds, and that have made the IRS, back off of them. So I would say there's probably at least a few million, and I'm hoping to recruit some more people into this. Like I said, taking on the IRS is not for the faint of heart or the weak of knees. But you can beat them. Things are stacked against you. The courts are stacked against you. The IRS is stacked against you. I think the IRS pays tax court judges under some legal arrangement, which needs to be ended. But the tax court sure does act like they're working for the IRS.
I got a couple of questions. One, is the income tax about the only tax we have that's proportional? It goes up. Graduated income tax.
Well, you mean like a graduated income tax?
Yeah. In other words, the more you make, the more you pay.
Well, I don't know, but the Forbes magazine did an analysis of, does raising the tax rate bring more money in? And what they discovered is that there is a negative 0.5 correlation between marginal tax rates and government revenue. In other words, when you raise marginal tax rates and you want to tax the rich, those nasty people up there that are making all that money, you bring in less money. When you lower the tax rates, you get more money.
Well, what happens when you get the rich aren't paying any taxes?
Then you have an economy that's booming.
But you're already $23 trillion in debt. How did that happen?
Because we've had politicians running our system and the Federal Reserve loaning money at interest to the government, to where most of that money is interest on the debt owed to the Federal Reserve.
I think you can actually find the
Question.
This is kind of responding. I'll ask Ken if he knows. If you take $483 billion since 1998, every year missing $483 billion from the budget, what does that add up to by 2019?
It means adds an awful lot of money. But
Isn't
the
that
fundamental problem is that from the beginning of our country until the income tax was implemented and got into gear, we had more surpluses than deficits. It's only after the income tax was implemented that we had deficits going out of control.
Would you have any idea how many people are in jail because they have not paid their income tax?
I don't know how many people are in jail for that, but I know that when the IRS decides that it wants to make an example of you, they'll either put you in jail or kill you.
Is there a group that's helping these people?
Yeah, well, there are people that are doing it. I mean, I know someone who's involved with helping political prisoners, because this country has a lot of political prisoners. And a lot of them have to do with the IRS.
I got one last question. If you get rid of the income tax, what are you gonna replace it with?
Excise taxes and tariffs.
Then everybody pays the same amount of tax.
Well, you pay tax when you buy something.
Now, but the whole point I'm getting at is that if everybody has to have a certain amount to live on.
That's correct.
And everybody has.
Well, look at this. Look at this, okay? If you're making barely enough money to survive, the IRS doesn't allow you to deduct your living expenses. So if you're making $20,000 a year and it's costing you $20,000 to live and they tax you for $2,000, you can't live.
So what happens to the graduated tax going up?
Well, it destroys the income of the United States. It destroys the country. We had 90% tax rates in the 50s.
That's right, to pay off a war debt.
Well, that's right, but it brings in less money than lower tax rates. Forbes did an analysis on that, and they proved, and you can look it up. You can look it up on your phone right now. Forbes did an analysis, and they said there is a negative 0.5 correlation between marginal tax rates and government revenue. When you raise tax rates, government revenue goes down, not up.
Well, anyway, I'm not gonna argue with you, but is there any more questions?
Isn't it true that had there been no Federal Reserve, there would have been no war debt because the government wouldn't have to borrow the money from itself?
That's correct.
Yeah, get rid of the Federal Reserve.
I think we're out of questions.
Okay.
You get to sit down.
All right.
Now it's your turn to talk. You get 5 minutes to either for or against what the speaker had to say. So who wants to be first? Let me prove this right.
I've got the camera focused on it where it is. Okay, I am here to disagree with Ken and try to, are you ready? I'm going to disagree with Ken and say stay the hell away from trying to mess with the IRS. Back in several decades of doing meetings in different legal reform venues, I developed a term for those who are going against the system, and I called them legal crash test dummies. And the plan is to, by some theory or other, or some legal understanding, to go against the system and see how hard you can hit the system and still bounce back. And most every one of those people were going to jail, in jail, out of jail. The cost is tremendous. I've known people lose their homes, their properties, their cars. If you're going to do this, I would consider putting everything in a trust well before you take on these folks. Now, is it a righteous cause? You're damn sure it is a righteous cause. It is a righteous cause, and somebody needs to do it. But you need to consider very carefully if you are that person, because the cost is enormous. It can be enormous. As far as some of the other things that were not brought up, one of the court cases with regard to assessment is U.S. v. Radinsky, and that has to do with the requirements for a qualified assessment officer, who is really the only one who can legally do an assessment on what taxes you owe. And the assessment officer, as I recall, and it's been many years since I've gone over this material, must be appointed by the the Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, it's something that they never do. So what I think Ken is stepping around here is that the IRS, even despite a lot of this, has a legal lawful role. And there are people and corporations that actually do owe taxes. And you may be, if you analyze it, you may be one of those people. You cannot necessarily say, without a careful investigation, you can't just say nobody owes any taxes, nobody owes any income taxes. So it is a complex situation. It's not black and white. What is black and white is that IRS agents and officials are overreaching their assigned duties. They're going outside of their authority and acting in ways that are unlawful. Yeah.
Ken, why isn't a good news organization like CNN, how come they haven't exposed this?
I have no idea.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Evening, everyone. I would just appreciate the opportunity. I would like to address the author's main arguments and essentially why they are not only incorrect, but they are dangerous for individuals who may actually personally adopt them, and I'll see if I can go through these systematically. First of all, the author contends that the income tax is effectively nullified, null and void, because it was not valid due to its interior language, or despite the fact that nullification, having very ugly associations in our history here in the United States, notably the Civil War, in the 1950s against desegregation. The Supreme Court ruled, especially in Cooper v. Aaron, 1958, that states cannot nullify laws that they disagree with. And that also applies to individuals. In fact, this argument has been attempted by numerous tax protesters in courts of law. None of them succeeded, and many of them ended up paying a very dear price for going up against that. Second of all, the author's contention was that Brushhaber affirmed direct taxes. That is the complete opposite conclusion of what the opinion ruled. The opinion in that case states that, please forgive me, quote, there can be no dispute that there was power by virtue of the amendment during that period to levy the tax without apportionment, and so far as the limits of the Constitution in other respects are concerned, the contention is not open, end quote. That is the affirmation in Brushhaber from 1916, and I have to wonder why, despite the fact that that decision is over 100 years old, this author would mislead you into believing the exact opposite of the case's rulings. Finally, I would like to address the point that this appears to be more of a partisan objection to certain elements of spending in our federal government and not actually any legitimate, valid consideration against the Constitution. The reason being, the author brings up unrelated stuff like socialized medicine, a very partisan term, or, talking about how we never needed an income tax before, which tends to be an association that is shared by very many conservative, partisan individuals who want to effectively nullify me. Well, I would like to inform this audience that 65 million people voted for Hillary Clinton, 65 million people voted for Barack Obama in 2012, and 69 million people voted for him in 2008. And I'm not getting nullified out of this country. So if you wish to disagree, let's settle it at the ballot box. But making my views illegitimate, unconstitutional, is basically a shot across my bow against my rights, and I will fight these arguments as long as I draw breath. Thank you very much.
Hi, yeah, I wasn't expecting to speak, but which author do you mean exactly? What's his name?
I believe it was Mr. King. Well, I don't
Oh,
know if
okay.
he's
I thought you were
the
talking
author.
about the author of the book.
The speaker.
Just want to clarify, the speaker.
I apologize
Okay.
for my lack of clarity.
Okay, that might nullify my reason to be here. But I don't believe that that Ken has any sense that the income tax should be nullified. I know Ken, I know that that's not what he believes. The income tax itself has value in a context and is legal in a context, and it applies to many people in a context, but not everybody. I think that's what I heard him say. And I think that's what the law says. It's not to be nullified, and nullification, I believe, if that's your concern, I want to try to reassure you that's not
Who are
what
the exceptions then?
the exceptions are people who don't exercise federal privilege. So the point of the way the law is set up
So
is to apply to
anyone who's
people.
not a public officer gets to not pay taxes? Is that your argument? sir?
It's not an argument, it's what the law states.
That's never been affirmed in a court of law, and a court of law is
Yeah.
how we define things.
Yeah, that's what you'll see in the Bruce Shaver decision itself was about a
Well,
railroad.
many
was
individuals
about
have
people
tried to
exercising
claim that their
privilege.
income doesn't apply.
Well,
to
let's
the
save the
IRS,
discussion
and
for
they
later.
were
He's got 5
actually
minutes.
shut
Yeah,
down.
yeah, well, we're not gonna argue, I
Save
did ask for some information, but that's not the point. The thing is, and I want to also try to reassure you and others that might feel it's partisan. My feeling personally is that this is existent regardless of party. Democrats and Republicans alike try to pay the minimum amount of tax possible. If you wanted to make a shooting match out of it, it's probably more likely that Republicans are more likely to pay the full amount. Just probably likely, if that's what somebody wanted to make it about. I don't make it about that personally. I personally know that the income tax has a context, and that we should all be aware of that context. I think that's the purpose of why I read the book, to understand it. Of course, there's a benefit in paying less than paying more, but if you're paying what you're legally owed, then you're fine. Also, just in terms of the context of criminality and law and all those things, and people in jail. People that are thrown in jail are people that have broken the law. People that file income tax in an educated way, trying to be as accurate as possible and swearing a statement on a form that is true and accurate according to what the law says, are not breaking the law. I personally have rebutted the IRS for years, since 1996, and had my ups and downs with it, but I never once innuendoed that I was breaking the law. The IRS gave me lots of hassle, never once said I broke a law, never once threatened anything, other than you owe me money, and that we worked things out and often compromised or whatever, and different things have worked out. But I am personally, and I wouldn't associate with Ken if I thought he was trying to find a way to get around the law. And I know that's not who he is, so. I'm standing up for your character, but also just for the context, to be clear, no one's advocating that the law be broken, no one's advocating that you do what I say and everything will be fine. Ken made it clear at the beginning that he's just his opinion. He's not trying to be a tax attorney on ad hoc person or whatever. It's just like, this is something that we've observed, this is something that some of us have done, and whether or not you do it or not, I recommend reading the book just to try to understand a different point of view. Whether or not, it's not a how-to, I mean, there can be some how-tos in there, but it's by far and away understanding what the law demands of you and what you have a right to do as a citizen. So if I was, I'm kind of a libertarian personally. If I was someone who was a Democrat on the left, I might want to educate myself on what the law demanded of me, so I wouldn't take on a burden higher than I otherwise needed to. So I think it should appeal to everybody, the value of the book.
First of all, I don't have a problem with income tax, okay? It's what has to be collected in order to have society function on a whole slew of levels and services. I do have a problem sometimes about who really is paying all the taxes, and they tend to be the lower and middle classes, okay? As it relates to people going to jail, as far as I'm concerned, there haven't been enough people put in jail for not paying income tax. And I would obviously put that towards the fact that, yeah, we have a booming economy, which to me is a little bit of a facade right now. But within that booming economy is an Amazon, okay? Jeff Bezos pays 0 tax. So I have a problem with that. And the inequality that comes out of the protection of this certain sliver of society, which is a thin one, okay? And I use the word sliver because I do consider them snake-like. It's just atrocious. We don't work in a bartering society. We are not a predominantly agrarian society, and we're not going to barter with you shoe my horses and my wife will bake you a pie, okay, society. So we need the income taxes, and even at the lower level, you know, of the economic strata, those individuals may end up not paying much income tax because of their wage level, but they pay into Social Security and Medicare. They don't get that refunded back to them. That goes into the system. Okay, just like even people that don't have papers, but they will pay taxes and they will also pay into a system that they will never collect from if they don't get papers, and they will never collect anyhow because it's probably collected on an illegal number. They don't have a number to file against. So there's a lot of stuff with the system that needs to be fixed if people want to wrap their heads around fixing it, okay? But sometimes bureaucracy serves those who they want it to serve, and that tends to be the top 1% or the top 10th of 1% in our particular country. And that's what needs to change dramatically, and they need to pay their fair share. And going back to a Reagan economy with the supply side economics, that's what put us into debt dramatically in the 80s to begin with. That's what put us into debt with Bush, and then we had the war on top of us, okay? And from a partisan perspective, it is an absolute fact, and you can research it, that Republicans, unbeknownst to I think most people, Republicans tend to cause the debt, Democrats tend to clean it up, okay? But getting back to Social Security, we've all paid into that system, okay? And so everyone, I don't know anyone that doesn't collect Social Security that stands there and says, well, I earned this, I paid into the system, and so I'm entitled to this. But what people collect in an average Social Security check in a given year, probably for the most part would not even amount to how much they've actually paid into the system over time. When I first came to this country, I don't know how long it was in play, the max you could ever pay into Social Security in a given year was $850. Once you reach that, you maxed out and they stopped taking it out of your salary, okay? Most people didn't reach it, the average Joe, okay? And that went on for a lot of years, and they started to raise it to 1,000. I think the max now is they can't take much more than 3,000 or something.
10.
How much is it?
I think it's 10.
I don't know if it goes that. I know Medicare has no top gap on it.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but
Yeah,
somewhere between 3 and 10.
Yeah, but it's a small amount in comparison to how much the majority of us will ever collect in a given year, and then from that point on, with cost of living, wages increase. And so unless everybody puts into that system, it's not going to feed out the back end. And that also that ends up having the elderly hopefully live in some kind of dignified style, although most of them don't at the lower income levels, in their old age. That was put in there, so people weren't going to die on the street in rags. Okay, that's an outcome of a Roosevelt administration. Okay, Medicare, an outcome of a Johnson administration. And these are societal goods, just like roads. Yeah, we need them. We're not into dirt tracks anymore. We don't have turnpikes that were around during the Civil War and so on and so forth, and they have to be paid for. Now, the fair way to do it would be to raise the tax on a gallon of gasoline. But no, we don't do that, because we don't want to upset the oil companies, or certain politicians don't want to upset the oil companies. So instead of the people who actually use the highways, who should be paying for the highways, we go out and we take more loans, and we give it to contractors, many of which are outside this country, and then we end up paying tolls till the donkeys come home, and those tolls never seem to disappear, even though there's supposed to be a state law that once the road is paid for, all tolls are supposed to go away. That doesn't happen anymore that I can see. They took them off of I-30. I wasn't around, but that's what I was told at the time. Once it was paid for, the toll booths came down. It's not happening. We are putting ourselves into a position for the greed of a few who pay nothing and who give nothing back. Okay? We are going to become more serf-like as every day goes on, and the Sheriff of Nottingham, we'll call it the Mr. IRS, is coming around and beating the peasants in the field to collect the tariffs so the kings may live well. Okay?
Are you aware of the excise tax? The gas tax is pretty high, and it does
It hasn't been changed since the 90s.
But it doesn't account for the cost of the roads.
Okay.
Not
Let's
even
say,
roads.
okay, we're in the 5 minute.
Oh, okay.
You're not allowed to ask me.
You have 5 minutes to get up on podium.
Gotcha.
Anybody else?
I didn't do it. I swear, I didn't do it. He asked me a question.
I thought I did not broke the rule.
No, did they not put in a tax on it? Tell me they did right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of amazed here. We've been given information in this talk that in fact the individual income tax collected does not in fact go to paying for any of these programs. It in fact goes to the Federal Reserve, gets paid out to, I think it goes through the Vatican. We had a speaker who spoke here, Jimmy Moriarty, who used to work in international banking. He actually did an audit of the Vatican Bank after the Blackfriar supposed suicide. And this had to do with a bishop who was pilfering the Vatican resources. So he got to get in there and look at where the Vatican money was going. It turns out the Vatican was simply laundering the money out to the wealthy elites, the royals of Europe, Rothschilds included. So they got their processing fee, but it wasn't being held there. So if you will notice, things have changed. How many are still making out a check to the IRS? The checks now are made to the U.S. Treasury, correct? Isn't that the current law?
Yeah.
So what changed is the system's being drawn back into the U.S. Treasury. In fact, the Federal Reserve is going away. If we can hopefully get another 4 years of the current administration and get this thing done. So what you're telling me here is you are worried about you being nullified, and I'm sitting here and I'm saying, okay, the law is all about language, logic, and reason, but the IRS code is written in Jabberwocky. They actually tried to computerize. They tried to computerize the IRS code and computerize the whole IRS system. They spent over $1 billion and finally failed. They couldn't do it because you've got a bunch of disconnects in there. Even a computer cannot follow all of the Jabberwocky in there. And this should not be a partisan issue.
Yes.
People who are hoping that they're not going to lose social programs or something, let me tell you, one of the greatest friends of the taxpayer was a Democrat. I had the good fortune to be able to interview former Congressman Jim Traficant.
Yes.
Jim Traficant saw to the passing of the 1998 Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Traficant was arrested and jailed and spent time in federal prison, and when asked what he was being charged with, he didn't even know what the charge was, but he knew what was happening as he went against the IRS. Another very brave person who went against the IRS was a liberal. I think maybe over time he became a little more conservative. Some of us met Aaron Russo. He made a blockbuster movie by the name of America, Freedom to Fascism. In it, he included an interview he had with the IRS commissioner. And I don't remember what the guy's name was, but I know he was commissioner sometime when I was having some communication with the IRS. So Russo went up against the system, exposed it, did a beautiful job, and then contracted pancreatic cancer very soon afterward. You know, we could be conspiratorial and draw a connection, and you know what? I would. So anyway, Sherry Peel Jackson, great lady. She paid for her speaking her story. Joe Bannister eventually won, but when you say won, is he had the case against him dismissed. I don't know what kind of a, you know, that's kind of a victory and a win, but it's not like, you know, he still had all the expense of fighting his case and so forth. There are attorneys who claim to be constitutional attorneys and you know, will come to your defense in an IRS case. Be careful about this. Larry B. Kraft basically takes a position, if a judge made a decision anywhere, then that's the law. So Congress doesn't pass the laws, judges do.
Yeah.
I sat right next to Larry B. Kraft and I said, Larry, a judge does not define my God-given rights. So we have a problem here. Courts make bad decisions. Judges make bad decisions. Fundamentally, we have to get back to the principles and what was the intent when this country was put together. When I look at the direct and indirect taxes, and in fact, Bruce Shaber is specifically a what do you call it? There we go. It's an excise. The Bruce Shaber decision clearly states that the tax has to be an excise tax.
Right.
When you read the decision. So I don't know about the confusion about a direct tax. It's kind of unclear there, but so I'm getting a little bit off track. Oh, the direct tax, basically, I guess I misunderstood the direct tax from your explanation, which I guess comes from Henderson, is that the states are doing the apportionments. What I understood of the direct tax is it was a capitation tax or a head tax pretty much on everyone that, in other words, if you've got to raise X amount of money, it might be apportioned by the states, but let's say everybody across the country had to pay $10. Well, can the beggar on the street beg $10? Can anybody come up with $10? Probably. At least they could have in this country in days past. But you're not going to get in a direct tax, you're not going to get like, you know, $10,000 out of everybody. And the way the direct tax is designed is you cannot have a progressive income tax. A progressive income tax is, in fact, a principle, a plank of the Communist Manifesto. It's amazing how these things get worked in there, and we're just supposed to consider that's our law, which I don't think was the initial intent. So let's see how things develop going forward. It would be wonderful, and I think the most equitable for everyone involved, if in fact we can have an excise tax upon purchases so that those who can afford to make the purchases can afford to make the tax.
Awesome.
I guess I'm the last one standing. I want to thank our speaker that he did a terrific job here of telling us what his problems were at the IRS was. And I give him his benefit, you know, you have a right to, it's one nice thing about a free society. You have a right to object to things, you have a right to challenge them, you have a right to go to court, you have a right to do all these different things. So that's within your rights, and I applaud you for that. But a couple of things that strike me. To my knowledge, income tax is the only progressive tax that we have. All the other taxes are a flat tax. And when you put on a flat tax, you have to recognize that everybody in this world has a certain amount of expenses they have to, just to live. It costs you so much. It costs you so much for rent. It costs you so much to do different things. And if you're making $1 million a year, like some people are, they're way ahead of the curve on what their basic needs are. And so a progressive income tax is perhaps the best thing that ever happened, because the richer people pay more, and it doesn't hurt them that much because they have what they have, etc. Now, after World War II, this country paid up to 90% taxes on the progressive scale, and that was to put away the debt. Today, we're $23 trillion in debt, and we're not paying for it. And the society, the average person can't pay that kind of debt because it'd kill them, because they wouldn't be able to survive, they wouldn't be able to eat, they wouldn't be able to do anything. So it should be graduated up. And in my own opinion, we need the more people make money, the more taxes they should have to pay, and especially to retire this debt. We had a speaker here some time ago, Moriarty, if you remember, and he was in Libya, and he was arguing that the Libyan government wanted to go on to the African dinar, which is gold-backed currency, and the paper bankers went after him, and that's why there was a war in Libya. And you could also argue about Saddam Hussein. He wanted to go on, put the euro on. He wanted to go on the. He wanted to put the oil on euros instead of dollars, and we went after him. And our banking system is such that our money that we have is based on what our government will pay. It's not based on gold or anything else. So our money is only backed by our promise to pay. And the end result is we have standing armies all over the world to protect this. And if we ever lose world currency, we'll be like Weimar Germany. We'll be walking around with bushel baskets full of money trying to buy a loaf of bread. It's not going to work. And we'll be collapsed as an economy. So we have to pay this debt down. How are you going to do it? And we had a huge debt after World War II. We got rid of it. We did it by raising taxes on the higher ups. And that can be done again. In my view, that's what has to happen. And it won't hurt the average person, but it will raise taxes on the higher ups, and they can afford it. And we can retire that debt, and the rest of the world will respect us for what we did. Anyway, that's my view on that. And another thing is, I was in the railroad industry. They reduced the size of crews from 5 to 2. We used to pay for retirement, and overnight we had more people on pension than we had working. So the pension fund was going up in smoke. They went after the corporation. You got to pay more. You got to do something. So now the railroad now pays 2.5 times what the employee pays for pension costs. That's how you solve the pension problem. And if they didn't do that, we'd all be in trouble. So these are part of the problems we have facing us today, and these are the directions we have to move in. So anyway, that's all I have to say. And we got to give this back to our speaker so he gets the last word.
Well, like Tom, I agree that we have the right to express our opinions, and I'm glad for this forum, and I'm glad that there's a number of us who disagree. I'm not going to jump into the political quagmire because there are opinions that we have about taxation and progressive taxation and things like that. I fundamentally disagree with it, but we'll save that discussion for another time. I never said the income tax was illegal. I said it's illegal as most people understand it, as a direct capitation from the federal government. It's legal as implemented by the IRS, as long as the IRS stays within the law. So, you know, one of the fundamental points I made was that this country lasted for 130 years without an income tax, and the government had more surpluses than deficits. If we got back to that system, we'd have the same thing all over again. More surpluses than deficits. It's only after the income tax was implemented that the deficits went sky high, and they've been going sky high ever since, and they've never come down. So that's one of the sources of the deficits is the income tax, I think, because it upends fundamental understandings of how our economic system should work. But anyway, what I'm here for is to try to encourage and recruit other people to join me in the fight against the IRS. Like I said before, it's not for the weak of knees or the faint of heart. The IRS is a formidable enemy. They are a snake, poisonous snake, and if you do the wrong thing, they will jump all over you. But if you follow the law and obey the law, I haven't paid a dime of federal tax for 6 years. And I'm still walking around, and I'm probably going to be walking around for a long time to come. I'm obeying the law. I emphasize that in every communication that I write to the IRS as I'm obeying the law. I'm doing what it says. I'd appreciate it if you would. But anyway, I welcome you to the fight. If you want to sign up and get updates, I'll update you on my situation. I understand that for you to join the fight, it's a personal decision. It's not something you do lightly. When I entered this fight, I understood that I could win or I could lose. And I could possibly lose badly with the IRS taking a lot of my money and doing that. I understood that as a real possibility, and it is a real possibility. So I don't want to encourage you to do something you're afraid of doing. However, if we don't force the government to follow the law, we're going to lose our country. The justice system is, as a matter of fact, if you want to see just how corrupt our justice system is, go to legalslave.com and watch the 5-minute video on that website. You will see corruption in all of its glory. And that's a federal judge, the same kind that sits on our appeals courts, and that should scare you.
That's in Dallas, too.
Yeah, that was in Dallas. So anyway, I encourage you to join the fight. I want you to understand it's not for the weak of knees or the faint of heart. But if you join the fight, the more of us that join it, the sooner we're going to get our country back and force the government to live within the law.
Just think, if you didn't pay income tax, just think how many more guns you can buy.
Well, that's it for tonight. That's it for tonight. The game's out here at 10:30. Our speaker's here, we want to talk to them. And hope to see you all next week.